Slavery in Rome. This is going to be quite lengthy. Before we start, the fundamental point which we need to take away from this is that all slaves in Rome were not the same, and all slaves were not equal. Some were educated, some were skilled, some were experts, some couldn't read or write. There was this vast array of different types of slave, and there were household slaves, but within that there were dozens of different types of household slave. In the bureaucracy of Rome, the government machinery of Rome, slaves existed. Farm slaves. We'll come on to the really quite extraordinary example of Tiro, Cicero's slave. But the point is, when you can't talk about slavery in Rome, you have to be precise, because the variation in types of slave and the places where they worked is enormous. Okay. So, most slaves were prisoners of war. Rome would go to war, they would defeat an opposing army. The majority of those men would become slaves. The example on this slide here, in one day, on the spot, Julius Caesar converted 53,000 Gauls from free Gaulish citizens to Roman slaves. As the empire expanded, more conquest, more defeated armies, more slaves. Some people would be born into slavery. Some people were abandoned by their parents when they were small. They would end up being slaves. And sometimes people became slaves because they were being punished for a crime. There were all sorts of ways people could become a slave, but the most common one is prisoners of war. You could buy slaves at slave markets. Delos was famously the biggest slave market in the Mediterranean, but Rome certainly had its own slave market. The reason Delos had such a huge trade in slaves is because of its proximity to Cilicia, which is along the south coast of modern-day Turkey, where there were pirates existed, and pirates would board ships, sink ships, take free people, turn them into slaves, sell them in Delos. Disgusting to us, but that's what they did. So let's imagine for a moment that you have decided to take the time out of your busy schedule to go and buy a slave. When you get there, the slaves would be on display, sometimes on revolving stands. They would be naked so that you could see if there was any disfigurement, any blemishes, any weaknesses, any illnesses. It was the same as an auction for any other goods. You had the right as a prospective purchaser to inspect what you were buying before you bought it. Slaves who came from abroad would be marked by having their feet whitened with chalk, so you could tell that this was a slave from overseas, as in contrast to a slave from Rome. The slaves would have a placard on their chest giving details about them. It was called a tituli, so that you could see what their specific skills were, what if they could sing, if they were literate, if they could speak another language, whatever it is, something that's more likely to make you want to buy that slave. Details were given. You would occasionally come across a slave with FUG branded on them. Yes, literally using the metal brand applied to human skin to burn it and permanently mark it. FUG being the abbreviated form of fugitivus, fugitive, or in our terms, a runaway. So you would know when you were buying this slave that in the past they had tried to run away from a previous owner, and that might make you less likely to buy it. But it's all part and parcel of the open nature of selling slaves. The price would vary according to the slave's age, their skills, the various qualities they might have that we've listed. Slaves with specific skills could be valued up to 12 times as highly as slaves without any such skills. So there's a real broad range of prices which is demarking these different kinds of slaves. It's kind of commodifying human life, breaking them up into degrees of worth. And female slaves, unless they were especially attractive, tended to be valued less than male slaves. Estimates vary as to how many slaves were in Rome. And when we talk about Rome at this time, we're talking about the Roman Republic, the entire landmass, not just the city of Rome. So in an overall population of the Roman Republic, from Gaul to modern day Turkey, about 7.5 million people. And it's estimated that up to 40% of that could have been slaves. Between 2 and 3 million. But within that, the richest 1.5% of Rome's citizens owned 49% of Rome's slaves. So it's clear that at the top of society, people had loads of slaves. And further down the hierarchy of society, people had much fewer. Many, many fewer. Now, the number of slaves reached a problematic point during Augustus's reign, and he actually put in place measures to stabilize the rise in the number of slaves. Slaves had no political rights. The quality of their life very often depended on their owner. They weren't allowed to marry, but with their owner's permission, they could live with another slave, and any child that was born of that relationship would become the owner's slave. Slaves that lived within a familia, this wider, expansive family unit, tended to be treated better, and I would imagine that's because when you're dealing with another human being day in and day out, relationships and bonds form, whereas if a slave was working in, shall we say, in the mines, there is no human relationship there. So there is poorer treatment. So being within the familia meant better treatment for slaves. Slaves were not bred. So you wouldn't find farms of human beings being harvested. And much as I would like to think that's because the Romans drew a line somewhere, it's also plausible that they did it on purely economic grounds. Raising children from birth is A, expensive, because at what age, let's say you need to raise a child until they're 7 or 8 before you can sell them as a slave. That's 7 years of no profit. But B, child mortality rates in the ancient world were incredibly high. So you could spend a year or 2 years or 3 years raising a child to be a slave and it would die. So why would you spend the time and the uncertainty in raising children when you could just buy a load of other adult slaves? It's grotesque, it's disgusting, but there we are. In the eyes of the law, slaves were property, not people. They had some rights, but they didn't have many. They could be bought, sold, you could leave them to your relatives in a will. They couldn't bring a legal action. And if you wanted a slave to testify in court for a legal case, their evidence would only be accepted if they were tortured first. Owners were within their rights to punish and kill slaves, but if we think in terms of a dishwasher, and I'm sure that the Romans employed some slaves to wash dishes, it makes no sense economically for you to kill your dishwasher, because you have to buy a new one, or you have to have it repaired if you beat it heavily. So in certain circumstances, it was less likely for a slave to be abused, but there were other circumstances, such as the mines, such as the latifundia, where cruelty to slaves was much more common. Rome didn't have factories, but I'm just disagreeing with my own presentation here. But it didn't have large-scale industry. It had factories, but there were less factories as we would recognize them. And I think workshops is better. But within a workshop, you could have a lot of slaves doing particular jobs. Without slaves producing bricks, especially, there would be Rome would have left much less of a physical impact on the landscape. Roman bricks for Roman construction all came from slaves. Construction and bakeries were two of the largest users of Roman slaves, or slaves in the Roman world, I should say. However, within that, some slaves were actually paid, which meant they could save and buy their freedom later on. Doesn't sound like the worst deal. In the towns, slaves would work hard, but the hours would be moderate compared to slaves elsewhere that we're going to look at in a moment. And they would actually get some holidays, some festival days. So being a slave in the towns, not too bad. Being a household or a domestic slave was very much kind of top of the tree stuff. You could be employed as a cook, as a gardener, as a cleaner, a scribe, a secretary. You could be a tutor. So whether you were skilled slave or unskilled slave, there would be work in the households for you. But because of that increased interaction with the master or the mistress, there would be closer bonds very often, and consequently treatment of domestic household slaves tended to be better. The Roman government itself made use of slaves, would employ educated slaves as clerks. They could work as assistants to the magistrates. And there were even some slaves in the emperor's civil service, this huge body, this retinue, this huge group of people who worked for the emperor. And some of those slaves could achieve freedom and a degree of power. Not too shabby. Much more shabby are the slaves on farms. Large estates or large farms, sometimes called latifundia, would work long hours and they would have very few holidays. Farm workers, yes, they would be fed, clothed and sheltered, and that is something, because the slaves in the mines weren't always guaranteed that. Some slaves in farms even managed to receive medical treatment. Again, if we think about the slave as an appliance, it often makes more sense to repair something than to buy a new one. But on the farms, there were prisons, and slaves who were disobedient would be thrown into prison. And the prison was literally a pit, a hole in the ground with a covering over it. Some farm slaves could be rewarded for their loyalty or for their hard work or for their obedience. But compared with domestic slaves, slaves on farms were very, very rarely freed by their owner. But I guess, we need to consider the notion that for some of these slaves, being freed might be worse for them. Yes, the long, difficult hours, back-breaking labour, all of that came as part and parcel of working on the farms. But if they weren't working on the farms, there was no guarantee of food, no guarantee of shelter, no guarantee of clothing. And all those three things were promised if they were a slave on a farm. Now, it's not much of an incentive, but for some slaves, especially those who did not have the characteristics to mark them out as a higher value, that is not nothing. Slaves in the mines had the worst jobs imaginable. Brutal conditions. Chain gangs existed. Men chained one to another. dragged around as though they were on a string. Long hours, sometimes even working through the night, cramped conditions underground, dangerous conditions. If you imagine all of the dangers of mining as a profession, from mine collapses to explosive gases, all of those things occurred. But there was none of the protections that certainly that we expect in the modern day, but certainly none of the protections that free people might have had. Most of the slaves who were sent to work in the mines were prisoners of war or they were criminals, and essentially it was a slow death sentence. If you weren't killed in a mine collapse, there was every chance that you would be worked until you were exhausted, until you died. Working in the mines, the worst possible. Unless being a gladiator is the worst. Which would you rather do? Work in the mine or be put into the arena? The conditions of being a gladiator are kind of, to me, they crystallize in the name of the title given to the guy who was employed to train them to fight in the arena, a lanista. And if you think of him as the man who trains gladiators, you think that's kind of, that doesn't sound too bad. But when you understand that Lannister is also the word for butcher, you get an idea of what it was like. Most gladiators, criminals, prisoners of war. The Lannister was not the owner of the slaves, though. That's the munerarios. The gladiator school, the ludus, would impose severe penalties for those who were not fighting sufficiently or training sufficiently, or there were severe punishments. They were regular, and much as I would love to say that 80% of gladiators managed to find their freedom, no, the majority of gladiators were killed in the arena. Maybe not on their first day, and they may have endured for a number of fights, but ultimately most gladiators were killed. Exceptional gladiators, absolutely exceptional, those who managed to fight for a long time or managed to win an enormous amount of support from the crowd, who had generated a huge amount of revenue, the Cristiano Ronaldo of their day. Those gladiators may be freed, and they would be given a wooden sword as a symbol that they were a gladiator, but now they are free. But remember, freedom from slavery for gladiators was very, very rare. The majority were killed. So, the treatment of slaves did improve as the empire, the expansion of the empire slowed down. Fewer conquests means the fewer new slaves coming in. At the time, the 1st century BC into the 1st century CE, a pervading philosophy which the Romans embraced, which is Greek in origin, is Stoicism, which I've noticed in the last year or so has actually undergone a resurgence. Certainly in bookshops that I've visited, there seems to be more and more books about Stoicism, because it's a very practical and it's an interesting ethical system to look at. Anyway, Stoicism recommends or encourages a life which is lived moderately, no extremes, but it also encourages the notion of humanity, and the idea that all people are the same. Now, it's unlikely that many Romans would have looked at slaves and imagined themselves to be the same. After all, there was no widespread move amongst Romans to abolish slavery. Some Roman writers wrote sympathetically about slaves, but a mass movement to end slavery did not exist. But at this time, through Stoicism, through this philosophy, there was a certain class of people who believed that slaves should be treated better. it was unpleasant to be a slave, but these ideas would have gradually softened some of the harsher edges to slave life. And of course, there's a practical consideration for slave owners. Slaves tended to be more loyal, they tended to be more obedient, and they tended to work harder for you if you treated them well. Maybe you could say something similar of teachers and pupils. I couldn't comment on that, obviously. If there was no mass movement to free or to abolish slavery, we do have a lot of recorded instances of individual slaves running away from their masters. It was a criminal offence for another person to give shelter to a runaway slave. Essentially, if you were a runaway slave, you are on your own. As mentioned previously, if you were caught as a runaway, you would be branded with FUG, fugitivus, runaway. And this acted as a warning to prospective new owners, and it also meant that your value as a slave went down. So you were less likely to be bought by a respectful or a compassionate or humane owner. There are some instances of slaves turning on their masters. The famous one is of Macedo, who was a harsh slave master, and his slaves beat him to death, and then they threw his body onto the heated floor of his bathhouse to see if he really was dead, because it was a hot floor. If he was simply beaten into unconsciousness, they imagined that the heated floor would wake him up again. In instances where slaves killed their master, the rule was that all of that master's slaves would then be put to death. In 61 CE, Lucius Pedanius Secundus was murdered by his slaves, and as a consequence of that, all 400 of his slaves were executed, including the innocent, obviously. So there are instances of slaves, a small group of slaves rebelling against their owner, but the punishments were ferocious. On the other side of that coin, we have a number of instances when slaves and their owners got along, and the exemplar, the most famous example, is of Cicero and Tiro. Tiro was an exceptionally talented man, exceptionally intelligent, and he was Cicero's amanuensis, his scribe, and he wrote down most of Cicero's literary works. He took minutes of meetings. He sat in on these meetings. So when Cicero meets Julius Caesar, Tiro is there. Tiro is also credited with inventing the system of shorthand, which we still use today, the system of taking notes in an abbreviated form so that you can write more quickly. That's Tiro. He was freed in Cicero's will, and he had a status which went far beyond not just all other slaves that we know of, but he had a status that went beyond a lot of freedmen. He made money. He had a full, rich, and productive life. But even the slaves who maybe didn't reach that kind of status, slaves were essential, because Roman teachers were slaves, Roman doctors were slaves, scribes, cooks, clerks, accountants, translators. All these educated positions in the Roman world were filled by slaves. So, let's have a look at some changes. Slightly beyond our period, into the reign of Claudius, more humane laws were introduced. had become common practice for masters to abandon their sick slaves on Tiber Island. There's an island in the Tiber, the river that runs through Rome. And on Tiber Island, there was a temple of Aesculapius, the god of medicine. And masters had taken to leaving their sick slaves on Tiber Island, and some of them died. But some of them recovered, at which point the masters came back and reclaimed their property. So, Claudius ruled that any slave that was abandoned and recovered on Tiber Island would then be freed. So it meant that masters either paid for the medical care of their slaves or they lost their slaves. Masters who chose to kill their slaves rather than look after them became more liable to be prosecuted for murder after the changes of Claudius. And finally, Domitian, he banned the castration of slaves. Eunuchs were very, very popular for slave owners. I'll let you do your own research into that rather than get into it here. So slightly beyond the period we're looking at, there were these further changes, but it seems that the harshest edges of Roman slavery were softened slightly by Augustus. There were occasions when slaves en masse rebelled. 3. The first mass slave revolt was in Sicily, and naturally it was from the countryside. All 3 of the slave rebellions on this slide, they originate in the countryside. Slaves coming from latifundia, from the large estates, from the big farms, en masse, as a huge group, they decide to rebel. So in Sicily in 135 to 132 BCE, again in Sicily 104 to 100 BCE, and finally, and the third one is the big one that everybody remembers, in Capua 73 to 71 BCE, and that is the slave revolt of Spartacus. It's worth considering that after these 3 revolts, they were put down brutally. If you imagine that 40% of the Roman world was slaves, you can understand that the ruling class of Rome would have looked at that and imagined, we cannot allow the idea to take root that slave rebellions can succeed, because otherwise Roman society would be turned upside down. All 3 of these rebellions were put down with a quite spectacular brutality. We'll look at the Spartacus revolt here. Spartacus is a Thracian gladiator. He broke out of the ludus in Capua in 73 BCE, and he led a group of skilled fighters. This is the origin. Later on, a lot of slaves come from the surrounding farmlands and the large estates, but it starts out with trained fighters, trained gladiators. So at the base of this rebellion, you have a force that is dangerous to deal with. So you can understand how the Romans would have been unsure how to approach a group of skilled fighters like this. They set up camp at the base of Mount Vesuvius, and they were joined by thousands of escaped slaves. At its peak, Spartacus's army had 150,000 men in it. It's hard to express how terrifying this prospect must have been to the ruling classes of Rome. Indeed, to everyday free Roman citizens, 150,000 slaves, armed and wandering the countryside. They managed to defeat a number of Roman armies, and eventually, 2 years after the rebellion started, Crassus put an end to the rebellion. And famously, Crassus took the remaining 6,000 of Spartacus's army and crucified them along the Appian Way for approximately 200 kilometers between Capua and Rome. It's hard for us to imagine that scale of visible cruelty. 6,000 men crucified. I'm not sure what the measurements are, but that's a degree of frequency. Can you imagine walking along that road, the Appian Way? How frequently you're going to be crossing another crucified man and another crucified man and another crucified man. It certainly sent out a message, because mass slave revolts after this didn't happen. Here's your skinny. Yeah, it is what it is. As usual, if you have any questions, come and see me in class. I hope this is useful.